An ordained minister has decided to give up God for a year.
How the heck do you just up and become atheist after being a pastor?
What I'm most worried about right now is figuring out how I can live openly and honestly.
I am finally free to be me.
I have no idea how to find friends or become a part of a community that's not religious.
What does life look like after church, after religion, after God?
That's it in a nutshell.
This is the Life After God podcast, a conversation on the space between belief and unbelief and beyond, with your host, Ryan Bell.
Hello, and welcome to the Life After God podcast. This is episode 65, and I'm your host, Ryan Bell. I have so much good stuff to share with you this week, I can hardly stand it. I had a really amazing conversation with Jessica Wilbanks a couple of weeks ago, and I'm excited to share that with you today. She is the author of the recent book, When I Spoke in Tongues, a story of faith and its loss. But before we get to that, a few announcements. This past week, I started a new Facebook group for members of Life After God. I'll tell you a little bit more about how to become a member in just a moment, but first, let me tell you what this new group is about. As I mentioned a few weeks ago in my New Year episode, I have been craving a community of people that want to go beyond non-theism. In a way, it's what Life After God has always been about, beyond what I am no longer, into moving into what I am now and what I'm becoming and what we are becoming together. I'm interested in what we can say with some degree of confidence about what a life after God or a life without God means. And I'm also interested in what it means to live with an irreducible uncertainty, which I think we often shy away from and the humanist community is often reluctant to address. This new group will feature a lot more interaction from me, personal interaction with me, unique conversations with some of our podcast guests, some Ask Me Anything sessions with our guests and other special people from the community, live video hangouts, and so much more. Think of it as an online learning community where we can share deeply about our questions, the challenges that we're facing, and the hopes that we have for our future. If you'd like to join that group, all you need to do is become a member of Life After God. A member is someone who's contributing $5 per month or more on the Patreon page. For about the price of a latte per month, you can know that you're supporting this podcast and participating in the community that is emerging from it. That being said, I understand that for some, even $5 per month is more than they can manage, and I don't want anyone to be excluded from membership due to financial hardship. So if you can't afford $5 per month, just message me. You can email me at ryan@lifeaftergod.org and let me know your situation, and we'll work out a sliding scale for you. Additionally, if you'd like to become a member of Life After God in a different way other than using Patreon, we can work that out too. Just email me at ryan@lifeaftergod.org and we will work out a plan. I also want to give a quick shout out to another project I'm working on related to my day job at the Secular Student Alliance. We've just launched a podcast as well. It actually launches today, Monday, February the 4th, and I'm super excited about it. It's called Secular Student Life, and you can find it on iTunes, Stitcher, or by going to secularstudents.org/podcast. I'll put a link, of course, in the show notes. I hope you'll check it out and learn what's happening with secular students on campuses all across the United States. This podcast is made possible by our members and patrons. I want to give a quick shout out to the new patrons this week: Don, Alan, Gretchen, Stephen, Lauren, and Meg. I'm so grateful for your support and membership, which makes this podcast and everything about Life After God possible. Special thanks to Uber patron Jeff Straka for his extraordinary generosity now and over the past several years. If this podcast adds value to your life and you'd like to help it keep going and reaching more people, I'd like to invite you to become a member. All you have to do is go to my Patreon page at patreon.com/lifeaftergod. You can contribute any amount you like, from as little as $1 to as much as you think this podcast is worth to you as a recurring monthly donation. The membership level starts at $5 a month, and at that point, you'll be able to join the Facebook group where members discuss podcast episodes, share their experiences, and support one another, give feedback, about the podcast and future episodes and a whole lot more. So I hope you'll consider becoming a member today. And with that, let's get to the main attraction. My guest today is Jessica Wilbanks. She is the author of a new book, When I Spoke in Tongues, A Story of Faith and Its Loss, published by Beacon Press. Jessica grew up in poverty in rural Maryland. The Pentecostal church of her childhood formed the foundation of her young life, and she has spent the years from her teens until today unraveling those experiences and trying to understand the strange attraction of fundamentalist spirituality and religion. Jessica received her MFA in creative nonfiction from the University of Houston and is an active member of the literary community in the city. She teaches writing workshops for Inprint, Writespace, Grackle Grackle, Writers League of Texas, and Boldface, the University of Houston's annual conference for emerging writers. Her essays have received a Pushcart Prize, the Wabash Nonfiction Prize from Sycamore Review, the Vandermeer Nonfiction Prize from Ruminate Magazine, and Ninth Letter's annual Creative Nonfiction Award. Her work has appeared in The Guardian, Salon, Houston Chronicle, Sojourners, The Rumpus, Long Reads, and LitHub, and has received notable mentions from Best American Essays and Best American Non-Required Reading. She was recently selected as a finalist for the National Penn Literary Award in Journalism. Here now is my conversation with Jessica Wilbanks. Jessica Wilbanks, thank you so much for being on the Life After God podcast.
It's so good to be here. Thank you, Ryan.
Yeah, it's I've been really looking forward to this. I've recently finished your book. It took me far too long because of so many other, books I was reading and work and all the rest, but also because I just found it so enjoyable. I was kind of savoring it. I don't know if you read that way or not, but I tend to read lots of books all at once, but I also I just love sort of enjoying each word, and so I was kind of going slow through it.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, that means a lot. I think, when I was writing it, I think I was really thinking of a particular audience, which is folks who have had the same experience as me of being such devout believers and then, deciding for whatever reason to leave the faith. So when I walked away from the church, which was when I was a teenager in the mid 90s, there were very little models for people who had figured out a way to be in relationship with their past, and figure out a way to process the experience they had of being a believer and then walking away. And it feels like that's something people are talking a lot more about now.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like your book read in some ways like a novel, which I mean as a compliment. Like it had that kind of sort of just narrative pull. And then I looked at your bio and you have an MFA in creative nonfiction. I was like, that makes a lot of sense. So, thanks for putting your heart into it. I could tell that you really, you didn't hold back. And I think part of the complexity of it is what I really want to ask you about today. But for those that haven't read it, I want to start back a little bit in the beginning and take just a couple of minutes. And obviously you wrote a book length version of this, but take just a couple of minutes and describe what your earliest religious memories were like.
Sure.
For the audience.
Yeah. So I don't remember a time from when I was a child that I don't remember a moment when I was really introduced to the church. It was just, something around me like oxygen. So my family, my parents converted to Christianity when they were dating. And that was kind of in the late 70s, the beginning of kind of the charismatic movement. They were born again in a backyard in suburban Virginia. And I have some early memories of attending an Assemblies of God congregation. And then when I was about, I want to say maybe 7 or 8 years old, we moved to Southern Maryland, where I lived for, my elementary years. And we attended Rock Church. So folks might be familiar with Bishop John Jimenez, who's a very charismatic pastor. his headquartered church was in Hampton, Virginia. He and his wife, Ann Jimenez, co-led that congregation. And then our church, Rock Church of Southern Maryland, was one of the first churches that was seeded, after the success of the headquarters congregation in Hampton. So yeah, I remember growing up, in this very tight-knit community, extremely conservative, although, I didn't really differentiate liberal and conservative at that point. It was just the way that life was.
Right.
And the church was, spirit filled. So folks spoke in tongues. We were slain in the spirit. There were prophecies, and those prophecies were translated. So that was just what I knew until I was a teenager.
It's amazing how, that those growing up, I talk about it the same way, totally different experience. Like we were not Pentecostal, but, when I'm trying to explain my former faith to, say, people that have grown up atheist all their life, I'm, constantly saying like, this is as if, someone was trying to explain gravity to you when you were 5 years old. You'd be like, it's just normal. It's just what you have, or if you met someone who didn't have gravity, you'd be like, what does that even mean?
Totally. I love the gravity metaphor. I always think of this. There's this famous graduation speech by David Foster Wallace. What is water? And he talks about how fish don't think of what surrounds them as water. It's just, it's like what we would think of as air. It's life. Yeah. And I think, that's one of the reasons why it's so traumatic to leave, because, in many ways, you don't realize when you're, first walking away, how deeply your life is permeated by every aspect of this faith. So even today, when I do the dishes, I hum hymns under my breath, and my husband gives me a funny look. But it's hard to drain all of that out of your life. And I don't know about you, but even though I've haven't identified as a fundamentalist Christian in many, many years, so I don't know about you, but the way that my mind operates now, I think out of many years of being so immersed in that worldview of things are either of the Lord or of the world, I find myself sometimes being a lot more judgmental about things than I should be. So for instance, if something happens in my life, I'm kind of quick to interpret it as, this is terrible, or this is great, and there's not as much gray area. And that's something that I'm kind of actively working on, as an adult.
Right. So your experience was growing up in it, but your parents, they converted to it. And you say at one point in the early part of your story how your parents, your father in particular, perhaps embraced the faith and this particular type of Christianity that he did out of a desire for some kind of moral certainty or something solid that he could grasp onto. Could you say a little bit more about that? Because I know it's interesting to me how, our experience, like yours and mine, of growing up in it, that's sort of one way of engaging with faith. But other times, to our amazement, people choose this.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes sense to me in retrospect because both of my parents had a lot of pain and loss in their early childhood. So my dad's father died of a heart attack when he was 6 years old, and his mother married multiple times, married some pretty bad guys, and he never really had anything resembling, some sort of, secure home as a kid. They moved around a lot. They didn't have, a hometown that they could go back to. There weren't close relationships with extended family. My mom had a similar situation. So her father passed away when she was 16 after a long period of separation. So, when I think about my parents, they were, in their early years. My mom was in her mid-20s. My dad was a little bit older. And they were at a moment, that was in the very late 70s, where society seemed so tumultuous. They didn't have those family relationships to kind of keep them anchored. My dad was kind of a transient worker. He was a bricklayer who kept getting fired because of his temper. And I think that experience for them of meeting this pastor and being welcomed into this community where there seemed like there was a lot of unconditional love. I think that was incredibly attractive to them. And especially, in those, my mom was working before she gave birth to me. And when she had me, she decided she wanted to stay home, which for her felt like a really countercultural choice and something that she was judged for. So I think being part of this community where, there was a firm belief that a woman's place was in the home, she felt accepted. So it's interesting.
Yeah, it's a way of flipping the script a little bit. I wonder, as I was reading your book and also hearing you talk about it right now, that the 70s really were, on a macro scale, very disruptive. And in some really, obviously, in some positive ways, coming right off of civil rights, the women's movement. And so for a lot of people, especially people in I would say, the norm of the United States, sort of the status quo, those that benefited from the status quo probably felt very upended by this in a similar way that I think a lot of people feel upended by the ongoing social changes in our culture today, and the way that people reach for something, not to minimize it in any way, but just to say, like, this is a way of, maybe some people reach for alcohol and other people reach for something much healthier in some ways, which is a community of people that love them and support them and approve of their sort of life choices and sort of validate their decisions. I totally agree. And another dynamic that I see as kind of really powerful in the community where I grew up was that, the 80s were a period of, there was a lot of wealth that was coming. There was this, renewed emphasis, like as women entered the workforce, there were, Murphy Brown was a sitcom that was really popular. And there was this big cultural conversation about, like, and the kind of binary that I see that I think my parents saw was you're either a traditional family, where there's, children are cared for and children's experience is centered in the family, or you throw out your values and, climb the corporate ladder and accumulate wealth. My parents were really trying to, I think, hold space for family, and I think I have mixed feelings in retrospect, not so mixed feelings, I think it was kind of an unfortunate decision that created this binary about family values versus career and education. But I think for them, what they were trying to do in going toward the church and becoming really part of the evangelical community was, create the firm, stable family structure that they didn't have when they were growing up. Right.
My mom was a latchkey kid and really resented it. And she just couldn't understand, why any woman would, choose to enter the workforce. So yeah, it's really hard for me at least, to separate their decision to become Christian with, separate it from the larger cultural conversation. And
of course,
it was kind of a reaction against that.
Right. Yeah. And then so to like move to the next step of your story, you're in high school and of course this is every young person's first sort of initial step out of the nest, as it were, making friends and experiencing the world in a more adult way. And you say in the book, you come to this point when you're in high school that you're in church and you have this kind of anxiety moment about what's going on. Can you tell us about that?
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't know if you've ever sat through one of these worship services before, but it was a dedication service for Rock Church of Baltimore. And so Bart Pierce, who's a evangelical minister, was the head of that congregation. And there were sermons, there was singing, there were different presentations, but during a long period of this worship service where the music was playing, there was this very kind of worshipful atmosphere that was created. I was looking around that congregation and, this was a community that I always felt part of. I always felt like I belonged. I felt that, we were the same people. And at that point, I had been going to high school. I had it was my first time really out in the world. I was homeschooled for a period. And then I lobbied my parents hard to let me apply for a scholarship to a private school, which was secular. And And I just started to feel so separate from the people in that congregation. And it was the first time that I had ever kind of looked at what happened in the church with judgment. I saw all these people who were working class, who lived somewhat hand to mouth, who were separate from the larger culture. And I just didn't want anything to do with it. I was ashamed of them. I was ashamed of the way people were dancing enthusiastically to the music and swaying and, lifting their hands. And, at that moment, I remember I wasn't brave enough to say I don't believe in God, but what I thought was, I'm not going to have anything to do with this anymore, regardless of whether God really exists or not. I'm going to take a break. I'm going to get away from this. And that was a huge step for me, because at that point, I hadn't even said a swear word before. I was afraid to, I was afraid. I had grown up with that purity culture, but I just didn't believe it anymore, and I wasn't able to enter into it, without that kind of self-consciousness. So yeah, it was a big moment for me. And from that point forward, I never really, went back. Although I think I really went on a journey of examining some of my reactions and realizing that, the shame that I had for, the place that I came from and the faith that I once believed in, that was something I really worked with over the next 20 years or so.
Right. It took you a long time to get through the rest of that. And I was going to say, like, a lot of times when I hear atheists talk about their deconversion stories or their experiences leaving religion, it's sort of like, a typical pattern is, my early faith was beautiful. It was embracing, it was loving, it was freeing and liberating. And then it became suddenly suffocating. Yeah. And then I left it, and it was one long trajectory of, ongoing freedom and liberation, and it was but what I pick up from your story that resonates so deeply with me, and so many other people that I talk to, is that your leaving Christianity was only the beginning of sort of a process of really coming to terms with what that all meant. And it wasn't just a beautiful, like wonderful experience of liberation, was it?
No, not at all. And I thought it would be. My story for myself as a teenager and in my early 20s was, I grew up, working class. I was a believer. I left all that behind. I went on to college. I, kind of climbed the ladder. But that didn't happen at all. So, my first big victory, which was getting out of my hometown. I got a scholarship to a private college, and, happily packed all my stuff and, went to college, had a wonderful time, partied a little more than I should have. My first year of college, I became incredibly depressed, and I found myself missing my family much more than I expected to. So I have 3 brothers who I'm very close to. And I, even though everything I'd done up until that point was about getting out, all I wanted, that first year of college was to go back. And I think that's when I really grappled with the fact that, I was trying to cut myself off from my roots. And ironically, what ended up happening, so I developed an eating disorder. I spent some time in a treatment center for women with anorexia. And then I ended up spending the next semester home with my family. My college, decided that I needed a little bit more time to heal before coming back. So I ended up, going back there. And I think that was the beginning of my reconciliation process and figuring out, okay, how do I come to embrace this new philosophy about belief? So, not being a believer, but how do I remain in relationship with my family, and how do I refrain from, judging people who didn't leave? And I think that's what, when I think about where conversations are right now about leaving faith, and there's this incredible dialogue amongst ex-evangelicals right now, which I've been following closely. Right. I think that's one piece that's a little different about my story, is that I left a long time ago, and since then, I remember that grief, I remember that anger, but I think I'm in a very different place now. I'm really interested in hearing more stories about what it's like to remain haunted by faith, rather than have that victorious departure from it.
Yeah, I think that's what resonates a lot with me too, and what drives me in the work I'm doing with Life After God, and even the work I'm doing with Secular Student Alliance is, the question of faith and the interesting stories and the mystery around it, and I think people's different experiences with it. It's not linear and uniform, and it's just fascinating to me. I try to take it out of there's clearly forms of religion that strike me as either wrong or right, in this kind of binary way, but there's also a big part of it that's just interesting to me, and it speaks to my curiosity, and that kind of leads us naturally into the next thing I wanted to ask you, which is, about the way that your departure from faith and your grappling with it in college and after college, and just your ongoing sort of attempt to understand your background and where you were at that moment led you on this global journey to sort of get to the root of it, if you could. Was there a root, and could you find it?
Yeah, it was very unexpected. So I was in graduate school at the time, and I think I was kind of casting about for a project. So I had gone to a MFA program. I had entered in fiction. I was writing stories. And I kept finding myself circling around, the community where I grew up, circling around my faith. And I hadn't written about that in years. I thought I had left all of that behind me. And I remember getting this wonderful piece of advice from this professor in my creative writing program who said, a writing project that will sustain you over years, a book project, pick something that you have very mixed feelings about, something where the writing process will be a journey of discovery, as opposed to simply, answering a question that is very clear to you. So I started thinking a lot about my childhood faith. I started doing research into the history of Pentecostalism, and I was just amazed. I was amazed at the roots of it. I was amazed at the way the faith has grown, particularly in places like southern Nigeria. So long story short, I ended up getting a grant to travel to southern Nigeria. And one of the questions I was really working on at that point was whether or not the faith actually had roots in Yoruba culture. So there's many scholars that point out that a lot of the practices that we see in Pentecostalism, so from kind of the oral nature of the faith, and the story-based sermons, and the use of percussion instruments and worship services, and the process of speaking in tongues and then having those, that language translated, a lot of that shows up in traditional Yoruba practice. So I kind of devised this research project. I went to Nigeria to answer this question, and I imagined that I would do some nonfiction writing about that. And what ended up happening was, for the first time, in 20 years, I was sitting through lengthy Pentecostal services. And anyone who has ever done that knows that, the clock just does not run out. I remember being a kid, and the pastor said, "Okay, it's 1 o'clock. Usually we would go home now, but the Spirit is moving, and we're going to be here for a while."
Oh,
so
boy.
everyone's like,
I know you described that one church service in southern Nigeria going, from like 8 a.m. until like midnight or something. It was just like unbelievable.
Yeah. It's really something, and it really, I had to make a decision, when I was doing that project. Am I going to ignore all the emotional responses that I'm having to sitting through these services again? I felt like I was 10 years old again. And I thought about all these things I hadn't thought about in years, everything from the role of that pastor, this charismatic man who, has the congregation in the palm of his hand, during these services, this message about the importance of, showing your faith in God by giving large offerings to the church. So all of this was just kind of swimming through my head. And it took me a while to decide that was actually a really important story to tell, the journey that I had gone on. So that surprised me in the writing process.
Yeah, no, and I think it's so interesting because there are these two big movements in your book, and I think I was so fascinated by the story of Maryland, and even just the descriptions of your farm and the sort of. I find it's difficult to write about personal experiences of, say, for example, poverty or fear or abuse or anything like that without sounding sort of whiny and like poor me and all of that. And yet you just, this kind of rich description, this very textured description of what your life was like. And I was so into it. And then all of a sudden you're in Africa and I was like, wow, this is like a whole nother book, this is like a whole nother story. And yet they're connected, obviously. I mean, you're the connecting piece, and just how our narratives drive us so far at times to explore who we are and what other people are like and how we're similar and how we're different. At the end of the book, you sort of come home from that experience, and as any, I think, interesting creative writing, you leave it open, which I think is fantastic, because it allows us to think about the reader, to think about where he or she is, and in this story. How would you describe your relationship with religion and faith and spirituality today? Are these different things, religion and spirituality, for you, or and do you have different feelings about them?
So at this point, I don't identify as a spiritual person or a religious person. So I don't attend any kind of religious community. I don't have a spiritual practice. But a couple of comments about that. So, even though I'm not part of a religious community, I think I still have the urge to be with people in some meaningful way. I think for me, that's been one of the hardest pieces about leaving the church is, I have this deep urge. So I have friends who make fun of me because whenever I sing in unison with a big group of people, whether it's, the anthem at a baseball game or Christmas carols, I always kind of, my eyes well up with tears, because I think there's just something so beautiful about being with people and, raising your voice in song. And I think that in a nutshell, that's what I miss about that spiritual community. But, I haven't found that, in any secular setting. So maybe that's something in my future. But the other thing that I think about that I never thought about until I had finished the book. So I got into a conversation on Twitter with someone who was talking about how inspired they had been when they were Pentecostal about this kind of mystical, spirit-filled process in which, the Holy Spirit enters you and, you sing in tongues and in a church service, and how they were really curious about whether or not there was a way to remain Pentecostal, but to throw out some of the traditional components of, purity culture and that sort of thing. And as I was in this kind of Twitter dialogue, I realized that, from when I was a kid, I had really loved the aspect of Pentecostal faith that was kind of that topsy-turvy component. So, the idea of worshiping a Messiah who had no earthly wealth or power, and I love, still today, I love hearing stories about the way that Christianity can be used for purposes of liberation, liberation theology, and, all the stories of folks who are led through their Christian faith to a position of kind of servant leadership, So I've been thinking about how in my own life, it's actually through my creative writing work that I think I've developed a sort of spiritual practice. So I think writing is one place where I try to come to the page without any preconceptions. I focus on images. I focus on sensory detail. And in that process of, writing and putting words on the page, I make discoveries, and I think there's some way that reminds me of the creative process of, Pentecostalism that I used to know as a kid. And I think if I didn't have that, I might be more likely to seek out some kind of replacement for that,
Right.
some sort of spiritual practice. But in a way, writing has become kind of a meditation process for me and a way of kind of building something from nothing. So I think that's a really interesting component for folks who leave a faith that included that mystical and spiritual element. They might find that in artistic practice on the other side of faith.
I think that's really an amazing insight. And I've sometimes thought that it's not, it's sort of like maybe not an accident of linguistics that the spirit in the religious sense and the idea that we talk about the human spirit, aren't so different. I mean, part of my sort of understanding of religion globally, over the long stretches of history, and certainly this isn't, I picked this up from Feuerbach and Freud and others, that that religion or belief in God is largely a kind of projection of our desires and our wishes for either life after death or immortality or ethics of some kind of a lofty notion of ethics that we project onto a large screen. And I think this idea of the human spirit, we're distrustful of it, rightly so, because it can lead us so many different places. And emotions being what they are, they can be great sources of positive inspiration, or they can drag us down to the depths. And, and so it is, like you say, this very topsy-turvy thing.
Totally. And I think, when I was researching some of the early days of Pentecostalism, that creative energy is just all over the place. Like, there's this wonderful story that I just couldn't get out of my head. I included it in my book about this young woman, Jenny Glassy. I don't know if you remember that section, but it's the story about how in the 19th century, she was 17 years old. She grew up on a farm in Missouri. This traveling minister comes to town, and she decides to run up to the altar and, give her heart to the Lord. And interestingly, she went back home, and she says that she has a vision of God appearing to her and telling her that she needs to go to West Africa. And she's this 17-year-old farm girl from Missouri. She's never been outside of Missouri, much less, to another country. And she managed to get part of the way there. So she ended up kind of teaming up with this minister who had converted her to Christianity, and making it all the way to Liverpool. And she had a lot of other adventures. But I was just thinking about how, what else at that particular time period could a young woman have embraced to get herself out of her hometown, and to see the world. Yeah. And I think, it's easy to forget about some of those more revolutionary, components of early Pentecostalism, like, for instance, the multiracial element. There were very few spaces at that time where folks of different races could gather together and, really relate to one another, as peers, given all the horrific racial policies in place at the time. It's really interesting, and it's not as cut and dry, as I thought it was when I walked away at 15. Although I think, where I've kind of landed is, I'm glad that we live in a society now where young women have many opportunities to, have that same sort of freedom, and people of different backgrounds and different racial identities don't need the church, as a place to gather. We can do that in a lot of different ways.
Right. Yeah. Because society has evolved. It makes me think of, I grew up Seventh-day Adventist, and in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, they have a prophetess actually, Ellen White, who is a key part of, and her husband, the key part of the founding of the church in the middle part of the 19th century. And, growing up, it was always, Ellen White said this and Ellen White said this, and you had to follow these instructions. They weren't the Bible, but pretty close. And, it was everything from how women should dress to what you should eat to the fact that mustard and caffeine were irritants and you shouldn't eat or drink them, and like, and I was so like, and how we were supposed to keep the Sabbath and the things you weren't allowed to do, and it was just this oppressive thing. And it wasn't until much later that it dawned on me that, here was a woman in the middle 19th century who basically founded a church, and then went on to found several medical facilities, traveled to Australia, founded a medical school and a seminary in Australia, basically with a second grade education. So it's a, even though the output of what she did was kind of, I don't know, a little dubious, but just the fact that she was empowered to do all of those things as a woman at a time when women were still really just not even able to vote. I totally agree. And that was something that I really saw in southern Nigeria as well. So there's just a fascinating history of the evolution of Christianity in that region. So, originally missionaries from Britain came over, and it was this very colonial impulse that led to the spread of Christianity. And then there was an interesting moment where there was a malaria outbreak. So these British missionaries were driven back to, Britain because of this malaria outbreak. And all of these new Nigerian converts to Christianity ended up having a lot of space to develop kind of the African independent churches at that point. And there was just so much, like if you look at the way that churches developed and the way that, far from those original colonialist impulses, which said, we need to, sing in English, we need to read English Bibles, you can't be a Christian unless you're wearing Western clothes. There's this really, really beautiful kind of evolution of some of Christian beliefs, but with very much, Nigerian culture. So yeah, it's fascinating. And I think in some ways, Pentecostal beliefs became this kind of blank slate in some way that folks were able to, put their own cultural beliefs on. And, it's just a shame, I think it's a human tendency that, we go toward control and we go toward kind of tying up some of these belief systems a little bit and, decreasing access. But in some ways, Pentecostalism has created a lot of space for people who might otherwise be marginalized, like women and back in the 19th century, like people of color as well. Yeah, and it does occur to me too, and I think it's worth mentioning that this type of open source religion and spirituality has also allowed for, powerful men to come in and get very wealthy off the, impulse to give money to these, causes, and at least here in the United States, the prosperity gospel and the way that it's sort of kept people in their place as well is kind of, and I think this just goes to what we were saying before about the double-edged sword. I mean, this kind of open source, kind of almost like a template onto which you could write your own sort of spiritual story. Exactly. And I think this is true of all kinds of religion, so, even more traditional, Western Christianity can be the source for, say, building hospitals and homeless shelters and helping children get through school and so forth. And it could also lead to hate crimes, so it's just whatever's in the person's heart kind of just comes out in whatever their expression of their religion is, it seems to me. Yeah. And I think that's especially true with Pentecostalism because there's no barrier for entry. In another religious tradition, you might not be able to have a church, or get a pulpit unless you, get a certain degree or unless you're voted in by a board of directors. And in Pentecostal communities, all you need is the word from the Lord, which on one hand, opens up space for people who don't have, traditional credentials, and that can be exciting. On the other hand, there's no checks and balances. So once, that pastor is in place and has a following, he or she, because,
in some cases, there are female Pentecostal evangelists as well. Things can go very bad. They can. The pastor of the church that I grew up in had a terrible temper and had a lot of blind spots, and had total freedom to exile certain members of the community who weren't, submitting to his will. And in some cases, that can go even more badly. In Nigeria, I have a chapter where I write about a phenomenon in which there's Pentecostal pastors who accuse children of being witches. And that's certainly something, that we see sometimes in the US as well. I grew up thinking that demonic spirits were real. And it's a very easy excuse, if you don't like what someone is doing or saying, to accuse them of being literally possessed by the devil. And that's incredibly dangerous.
Really? So true.
Yeah.
I know we're kind of coming to the end of our time, and I just really, again, so grateful. I think every time someone tells their story, especially in such a compelling way, it gives other people something to hang on to, or some hooks maybe, where they can sort of kind of relate their own journey to someone else's. And I think one of the powerful things about the podcast medium is that, we can tell these stories and people can hear echoes of their own experience in them. And I just wonder, in closing, if you, as you look back over your journey, and of course your journey is only partway finished, of course, you have many more experiences ahead of you, but at this point in your experience, I mean, what would you say to people who are listening right now, who are kind of where you were when you were like 15? And you were just at that place of going, I don't think this is true, but I'm scared of what that might mean.
Yeah. I think the biggest thing that I would say is to be gentle with yourself. I've been part of a lot of these Facebook groups that have popped up for people who have left religious traditions. And I think there's such a mix of emotions when you first start questioning. So, many people feel anger because it seems like everything they've done up until, the point when they walked away from the church is a waste. They look back at decisions that they've made. Maybe they got married when they were very young and it didn't work out. Maybe they, didn't get the educational opportunities that they now wish they had. Or maybe they just, mourn the fact that they didn't have all these experiences that they could have had, as a young person. So that kind of anger is completely understandable. But I think that, as much as we would like to think that belief is an on and off switch, and, one day those doubts pile up to the point that you decide to walk away, I wish folks could see, who are at the beginning of that journey, that it's nothing like that on and off switch. You will have moments where you mourn what you had, where you mourn the relationships and the ease of, relationships with family and loved ones, where you wish you could go back, to get the support or to get, some of that community back. But I think it's like any process of grief, when we lose someone or something that's very dear to us, it takes a long time to cycle through all of those emotions and to feel that loss. And I think probably the biggest piece of advice I would have is, don't do it by yourself. Figure out a way to let some of those feelings out. And there's a lot of great ways to do that. I know that you through Life After God, work with some people who need some support, just processing some of that.
Right.
There's also some great communities now on social media where folks can hear about what other people's experiences are and get advice about how to recreate a community that's going to give them that support. But I think that's what happened to me in college. Like I thought I could do it all by myself, and I thought I could immediately turn off all of those feelings of grief and pain, and ended up not being able to do that. But now, even with that behind me, I think it was a vital part of my journey. And I think that it's really important to give yourself time, to go through that process and and really begin to develop the trust in yourself. Because often those of us who have come from these kinds of faith traditions don't have that kind of trust in ourselves and our own decisions. So
yeah, that's huge. Yeah. In fact, many of us taught to distrust ourselves,
Absolutely.
And then when you lose your faith, then you've really got nothing. You don't have God, you don't have yourself. So you're like really out there.
Yeah.
I remember speaking to another young woman named Brooke on the podcast. And she was talking about just, like learning how to even know what a good choice felt like.
Absolutely.
Or like she was talking about how like she was choosing friends really badly, like people that were like bad for her in multiple different ways, and not really just not having the tools to know, is this a person I should trust or not?
Yeah.
And for people that didn't grow up in that environment, they're like, how could you not know? Like, that's just an intuition, right? That you get when you kind of grow up. And she was like, no, I didn't learn that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such a good point, and something that I wish more people talked about. And the other piece for me too is I don't know if you see this in your work sometimes or in your own journey, but I think there was also a side of me when I walked away from the church that said, okay, now I'm damned. I'd always been taught that folks who backslid, who rejected Christianity were evil, were on the side of the devil now.
Right, exactly.
And I think that part of me, even though I didn't intellectually believe that, when I left the church, I think some part of me subconsciously believed that and said, okay, I don't have anything to live for. I can do whatever I want. I don't have to follow any kind of moral code. And I think it took me many years to build up a different kind of moral compass, that didn't have as much to do with sexuality or, swearing or drinking or smoking or all those things, but had a lot to do with how I treated people, and how I treated myself. And I think, like you said, that's it. We underestimate the time that it will take to craft that for ourselves when for so long we've been following someone else's moral compass.
Yeah. And just to give yourself time.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I guess before you go, like, what are you working on now? What's the next thing for you?
Yeah, so I have a few projects. I'm working on actually a novel right now, which is a new space for me. Yeah. I think that, now that I have this book under my belt, I'm a little bit more confident, in writing, and it takes a lot of, a different kind of faith to come to a blank page and try to create a new world. But it's been really fun. So I'm just at the beginning process of that. I'm also doing a lot of creative writing teaching. So I do some online classes and some in-person classes here in my city of Houston. So it's a fun place to be, and I'm really enjoying the process too of, doing podcasts like this and hearing from folks who have had similar journeys. So if folks are interested in sharing their story, my contact information is on my website, jessicawilbanks.com. And I'd really love to hear from readers who have had similar experiences.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I know many people will check out your website and maybe sign up for one of your classes.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Ryan. This has been such a pleasure.
Yeah, pleasure to talk to you as well. Thank you so much for spending this portion of your day with me. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Jessica Wilbanks, and I really hope that you will buy her book and read it, When I Spoke in Tongues, A Story of Faith and Its Loss. I really enjoyed reading it myself. I read every word, and it took me a bit longer than it often does because I really enjoyed the prose as well as the narrative. So check it out. You won't be disappointed. If you want to stay in touch with everything we're doing at Life After God, please visit our website at lifeaftergod.org and sign up for our newsletter. You can also subscribe to all of our social media channels right from the website. Thank you again to those of you who support Life After God every month. If you want to become a member, please visit patreon.com/lifeaftergod, where you can make a monthly recurring donation of any amount that you like. Join me in 2 weeks for the next episode. Until then, I'm your host, Ryan Bell, and this has been the Life After God podcast.